Hi there, and welcome back to our Starsector pirate campaign. So in the previous episode, we invaded the hegemony capital of Chickamaustock, and along the way we earned enough experience to get to level 15, which is the maximum level that can be achieved without mods. And I decided to invest our last skill point into weapon drills from the leadership skill tree. I don't have any particular love for this skill, as the damage bonus it confers is not particularly large. But it is a combat-focused skill that improves our entire fleet, which makes it superior to any of the other options available to us right now. If you've been keeping up with the Starsector blog, you'll know that the developers are aiming to refresh many of the skills in the next update, along with an improvement in the way that burn drive works on low-tech ships. And if you're interested in that but haven't had a chance to read the blog yet, I'll leave some links to the relevant posts in the description below. But getting back to what we're doing at the moment, I finally remembered to exchange the Gladius fighters that we had in the Odyssey with some broadswords, which I think should do better in that role. And I also reconfigured the Astral so it now has 2 dagger, 1 Kopesh, and 3 Piranha Bomber wings. With that out of the way, I've decided that the next thing we should do is to consolidate our position here in the Aslan system by taking the hegemonic colony of Coatl as well. It's currently only being defended by a Tier 2 orbital station, along with a small contingent of hegemony ships. And since we used the Odyssey against the Star Fortress, I think we'll just fly the Eagle this time. In the last episode, we used the Eagle in our pursuit battle, having already won the fight against the bulk of the defensive forces, so that wasn't really a fair assessment of its capabilities. I think this fight will give us a much better idea about whether its build is working. However, just in case the build is a dud, I've brought in our 3 capital ships, along with a handful of escorts, just to be sure. As with prior battles against orbital stations, I've created a line of ships that is far enough away from the station that my ships should be able to safely disengage by simply backing up to beyond the station's maximum weapon range. The intention is to keep them close enough that they'll be able to provide support if I get into trouble, while staying fresh enough to ensure that they survive the encounter as well. And our Heron has very bravely stepped up to eat the first wave of bombers. That's not really its job, but we might as well use this opportunity to get some damage in on the station. While we take care of that, some of you may remember from the last episode that my wife and I had been invited to a housewarming party. Well, since then, the party has taken place, and I wouldn't say it was the unmitigated disaster that I was expecting. For one, there was a distinct lack of furniture, as I had predicted, but all of the adults in attendance quite happily reverted to their younger selves, and like a clutch of primary school children attending a sleepover, simply sat in a circle on the floor, probably discovering that their backsides, bolstered by some lockdown-induced weight gain, had become marginally less uncomfortable to sit on. The only rooms that were fully furnished were a room that was dedicated to the owner's 3 cats, and the attic, which featured a pool table and an air conditioning unit that was turned on but not connected to the outdoors. For those of you who live in a more civilized part of the world, pool is a bit like snooker, but for peasants. The table is smaller, there are fewer balls, and you're not required to dress in a vest and bow tie in order to play. The other highlight was the children. There were quite a few of them there, and my son was the only boy in attendance. In addition, most of the girls were several years older than him, so despite their best efforts to help him feel included, there was definitely some friction in their interactions. I particularly remember one instance in which the girls were partaking in some make-believe yoga meditation, silently sitting cross-legged with their eyes closed, and there was my son meandering between them, happily clapping his hands and stomping his feet as he loudly proclaimed how good of a job they were doing. And then there was the incident with the s'mores. For those of you unfamiliar, a s'more is basically a toasted marshmallow sandwiched between 2 layers of crackers. There's typically also some chocolate involved, but the host had no chocolate available, so we made do without. Anyway, one of the men manning the grills on the patio had cleared away some space in order for the children to toast their marshmallows. And at some point there must have been a mix-up, because one of the girls ended up with 2 toasted marshmallows while another had none. And this inevitably resulted in a fit of crying that somehow ended with the girl planting herself on top of the cooler that had all of the alcohol in it. So there was the girl bawling her eyes out, her mother trying to console her, and a ring of adults quietly conferring with each other on their plan of attack, on how best to extract their beverages from a cooler that had a crying girl on top of it. The standoff was ultimately resolved by the guy at the grill, who was able to coax the girl off the cooler with the promise of newly toasted marshmallows. So to the hero manning the grill that day, I salute you. Okay, so we've made some progress against the space station, but as expected, things are a bit slower going than with the Odyssey. However, overall I'm pretty satisfied with the performance of the Eagle so far. The shields have been sufficiently sturdy for me to stay in the fight long enough to actually do some damage, and the ion pulsars are doing an admirable job of keeping the enemy shields down. And the ion pulsar's charge cycle is short enough that I'm effectively able to maintain pressure without allowing the enemy to vent. You may have noticed that anytime I let up off the ion pulsars, the enemy will actually try to put their shields back up. And that's because the assault chain guns by themselves do so little damage to the shields that cycling their shields like that is actually an effective strategy for them. Fortunately, I'm under no particular time pressure in this fight, as all of our ships came in with full combat readiness. And even if these proceedings dragged on for long enough that I had to send the Omen away, the lack of point defense wouldn't be so much of a concern because I don't have to worry about the station spewing out mines all of the time. However, I also don't want to be here all day, so perhaps it would be a good idea to put an engage order on the station, just to make sure that everyone is doing their part. And I'm gonna clear away the rest of these waypoints so that our ships don't try to congregate at any of them. Well, this big module is pretty high on flux, so I'm gonna try and get some damage in, but I don't expect to make a huge dent considering our lack of fire support at the moment. Well, it seems we might be here for a while, so I thought I'd discuss something that's been on my mind. I already mentioned how the developers have released some blog posts detailing the sorts of changes they're planning to make in the next update, but reading those recent posts actually brought to mind a much earlier post from several years ago that laid out the history of the Persean sector. Again, I'll provide a link in the description below, but to summarize, at some point in the distant past, at least from the perspective of the game's timeline, humanity started colonizing the stars, slowly at first, but then much faster once FTL, faster than light travel, was invented. Even though Earth was ultimately destroyed, or at least rendered uninhabitable, a single unified empire arose, with the legal and logistical framework to govern a large expanse of interstellar space, supported by the ability to quickly travel across vast distances using networks of jump gates. Eventually, this network of jump gates would spread out as far as the region of space that would come to be known as the Persean sector, and then, quite unexpectedly, the jump gates stopped working. The Luddites attribute this event to some sort of miracle that came about when the Empire tried to transport a prisoner called Lud, the figurehead of their faith, through the gate network for execution. Whatever the cause, everyone in the Persean sector at the time of the collapse was effectively cut off, with no means of contacting the central government or returning to a region of space where the gate network might still function. And the game's date system is also synchronized with this event. So when you start the game in cycle 206, that means, presumably, 206 standard Earth years after the collapse of the gate network. There was one large military fleet en route to the Persean sector at the time, and you can see remnants of that scattered about as the derelict 14th Battlegroup ships, many of which had to be left behind in order for the survivors of that fleet to limp their way to the Persean sector using standard hyperspace travel. After the collapse, the major factions separated out based on their chosen ideology, and there have been a few major armed conflicts prior to the game's start date, largely between the Hegemony, Church, and Tritachyon around the use of AI technology, and within the Asconia system, which resulted in the destruction of one of the sector's major population centers, and the subsequent creation of the Syndrian Diktat as an independent body. Whew, that was a mouthful. So there are things that I quite like about the game's story and lore, but also some things that I take issue with when examining them in more detail. The first is that the Persean sector is framed as existing on the frontier. So similar to a game like RimWorld, this helps to establish a technological baseline that is still relatable to us troglodytes in the distant past of the 21st century. But it offers little glimpses of a glorious future where technology has really started to become indistinguishable from magic, where you can have fleets of shining new vessels that can sail the void between the stars. But there are still untold millions barely eking out a living in the dark underholes of some vast, groaning metropolis, where weapons like cannons, which have existed for centuries even in our time, are still competitive against the best high-tech gadgetry that money can buy. In addition, limits have been imposed on technologies, such as artificial intelligence, that would completely trivialize certain problems in the civilization. And you see examples of this in many settings, whether it's the Butlerian Jihad in Dune, or the cybernetic revolt during the Dark Age of Technology in Warhammer 40,000. And there are also other factors creating sort of technological inertia. In Battletech, the fall of the Star League and subsequent succession wars leave little room for research and development. Similarly, in Starsector, the factions not overtly hostile to technology, Tritachyon and the Persean League, are either held back by the other major powers, or too embroiled in their own petty squabbles to get much done. It seems that creators of fiction, both old and new, have, on the whole, sacrificed technology in order to maintain relatability. And speaking of sacrifice, it looks like the Hegemony has sent in an invasion fleet to try and retake Chickamaustock. That's unfortunate. I had rather hoped that I'd be able to get started on the next step in the Galatia Academy storyline. But as I said previously, I'd really prefer not to redo that Star Fortress fight, so duty calls. Anyway, back to the story. So, since I mentioned the Galatia Academy questline, perhaps now would be a good time for me to air my biggest grievance with it. So one day, your daring space captain happens to stumble upon the Galatia Academy, a small group operating outside the status quo, achieving some sort of true progress on timescales that are incredibly short in the context of the setting. And I must warn you that what's coming up may sound like a nitpick, but if it is a nitpick, then it's one that I have with a great many fictional settings, including all the ones I already mentioned. So to begin, imagine for a moment you're trying to delete something from the internet, something conspicuous, something important, say a fully functional artificial general intelligence, or a device capable of faster than light travel. Do you think you would succeed? Probably not. As Isaac Asimov said, there is a single light of science, and to brighten it anywhere is to brighten it everywhere. That's especially true in an age when our ability to transfer our knowledge to anyone anywhere has made extinguishing that light almost impossible. Most of us today carry a device in our pocket that can hold as much information as an entire library of books. And in the event of a catastrophe, it only takes one surviving copy, redistributed online or by word of mouth or carrier pigeon, or whatever means of communication still exists, to bring all of that knowledge back to the masses. In the case of Starsector, why have the jump gates been offline for 200 years? Just think of how long of a time that is, 200 years. 200 years ago, if we were not both dead of smallpox or polio, I would be communicating to you on a piece of paper, carried by horse or sailing ship for weeks and months, and it would probably only be in the form of crude drawings because neither of us had ever learned to read, and those drawings would probably have been made from the dirt caked on the bottom of my foot, because I would not have been able to afford a pen or shoes. My point is, 200 years is a long time. To me, it's unthinkable that nobody in the Persean sector would have solved the problem of the jump gates in over 200 years. I mean, we're not talking about some sort of fringe science. In-universe, the jump gates were instrumental to maintaining a cohesive interstellar empire. The jump gates were used by everyone, everywhere. Of course, I'm not suggesting that everyone who used a jump gate knew how they functioned. I mean, I drive a car, but I've only ever seen pictures of the inside of an internal combustion engine. But I definitely live within driving distance of someone who does know how my car works. Probably hundreds of people. Even if the science behind the jump gates were a closely guarded secret, I can't see how a functioning interstellar empire could neglect to station people with knowledge of how to repair and maintain them at each gate in case of a failure. I mean, we're not talking about some enormously bloated Kafkaesque nightmare like 40K's Imperium of Man. This was an empire that could build megastructures on the scale of the coronal hypershunts in a frontier backwater like the Persean sector. Putting all that aside, even if we accept that the knowledge of how the gates worked was lost, there's still the question of why now? The very fact that the Galatia Academy exists, and, despite some setbacks, is ultimately able to achieve many of its research goals, shows that an independent group can operate outside the watchful gaze of the major factions, and possesses the motivation to actually get the gates back online. Where was this motivation 200 years ago when the gate network first collapsed, when people were cut off from their homes and families, when the people who had some tangible connections beyond the Persean sector were still alive? Surely they would have wanted to get back to where they came from, to be reunited with their friends and loved ones within their own lifetimes. Where was this motivation 100 years ago during the first AI war? when a rapid transit system as powerful as the Gate network would surely have tipped the scales of power in favor of whichever faction was able to harness it first. Just imagine the strategic importance of being able to open a back door into your opponent's star system, and being able to move around fleets, personnel, and supplies at a pace that your enemy simply can't match. Surely the military minds on Chickamaustock would have salivated at those possibilities. And where was the motivation just a few decades ago when a planet killer destroyed Opus, displacing millions who would surely have wanted to escape a Persean sector that was slowly tearing itself apart? If necessity truly is the mother of invention, then the dire need of all those refugees would surely have been directed towards a great deal of invention. So that's my biggest gripe at the moment. Having 200 years of backstory makes for an environment that is ripe with good tales to tell, but it also begets questions about what people have been doing all that time. As the Galatia questline itself demonstrates, it doesn't take a lot. Just a renegade school teacher, a few bright students, and one drunk, motivationally impaired space captain to erase 2 centuries of stagnation. Alright, well, I've been chugging along on this runaway train of thought for long enough. So what do you think? Does the game's lore and backstory interest you? Or have I wasted many hours of my life laboring over a throwaway detail in an otherwise stellar game? Feel free to let me know down in the comments. To be fair, I'm not calling out Starsector specifically. These sorts of things plague fictional universes everywhere, and I completely understand that sometimes things are the way they are because that's what the plot requires. It's just not a very satisfying answer. By the way, if you're interested in space travel and other sorts of futuristic technologies, I would recommend a channel called SFIA, Science and Futurism with Isaac Arthur. I've been keeping up with Isaac's videos for some time now, and he's usually got a lot of interesting things to say about the topics that he covers. Overall, he tends to view humanity's future a little bit more optimistically than I do, but I suppose that comes with the territory if you're going to spend a lot of time considering the future of the species with anything other than existential dread. However, I do find myself agreeing with him more often than not. In any case, his channel is linked in the description for those of you who are interested. Great. Now that I've spent almost an entire episode talking about the game's lore and story, I've worked up quite the appetite to get the main questline moving again. So I think in the next episode, we'll start by trying to find that renegade scientist, Silicarus. So until then, thank you so much for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you out there in the sector.